Hi everyone, I'm Adri Hayden, and the topic that I will be speaking about today is ancient Egyptian love poetry. When reading literature from ancient Egypt, it is important to understand the culture and customs of the time period. According to Ian Shaw, in his book Oxford History of Ancient Egypt, the country was extremely wealthy and powerful in between the period of 1300 and 1100 BCE. Although society still consisted of social classes, there were a large number of elitists. They enjoyed expressing their wealth in artistic beauty such as temple art, gold idols, and literature. They were also frequent religious ceremonies, festivals, and banquets. Due to periods where the royal family had no sons, female roles began to be seen as more prominent. Radwa Khalil discusses this in the article How Knowledge of Ancient Egyptian Women Can Influence Today's Gender Role. Does History Matter in General Psychology? Social dignity was not based on gender, and freedom and opportunity were equally available to both men and women. This resulted in many texts, particularly those of love poetry, written with equally spoken male and female parts. The poems were written primarily to be performed at banquets, encouraging exaggeration in the works and a dramatic emphasis on the dialogue between the male and female characters. Another interesting factor to note about the ancient works of literature is that they are thought to have been written primarily by educated adolescents. The characters in many of the texts are still living with their parents and have to sneak out to meet their secret love. Because the young authors were provided for financially and had few responsibilities, they had the time and energy to experience, or possibly just fantasize about these love scenarios, inspiring the poetry that is presented in our modern-day textbooks. Instead of being read as they are now, however, they were performed and accompanied by music, dance, and other forms of art for the audiences. According to Khan Academy, Rosetta Stone offers translation of hieroglyphs and Egyptian writing, with the original language stone available to view in the British Museum in London. The original stone would have been around 2 meters high, but what we know today is the broken off top of the stone. 3 types of ancient Egyptian texts are engraved on the stone, and allow historical linguists to provide more accurate translations of other Egyptian texts. The translation of the poem provided to us today may sound somewhat bland in language, although the use of imagery provides the reader with an appreciation of the reading. It is likely that much of the rhyme and rhythm was lost in translation. One example of the limitations of translation occurs where, in the original text, each stanza begins with a word pun. This is noted in the Norton Anthology World Literature on page 32. Listening to the poem read in this manner would be quite different to reading it in English today. The poem in which I chose to focus my literature assignment is titled The Beginning of the Song That Diverts the Heart. In summary, it tells the tale of 2 lovers who declare their love to one another and believe that they simply cannot be without the other. As the culture did not perceive sexual relations before marriage as immoral, the society was very open to sexual art and literature. There are many references that may have been considered indecent to other cultures, particularly at this time period, as the female body may not have been as glorified or even as openly talked about as it was in Egypt. Other than the many sexual references made throughout the writing, symbolism is heavily used, and through this, readers or listeners can observe cultural differences in ancient Egypt and the world we know today. One example of this symbolism is the lotus, which is also addressed in many other Egyptian works. The Norton Anthology World Literature refers to lotus as the most important Egyptian flower whose aroma was held to excite the senses. It is even thought that the flower may have been used to make drugs similar to ecstasy, so by referring to her lover as the lotus flower, she basically calls him her own personal high. Another interesting concept from the poem is that roles and customs of society are addressed, such as having a Nubian maid, who would assist elitist females in activities such as getting dressed or bringing food. This allows scholars to be able to reflect more deeply on the ways of the time period of Egyptian history. As a reader, I noticed the youthful mindset in the poetry, before I had researched the literature, simply because of the relatable modern element of secret lovers. Adolescents sneaking out of their parents' homes and meeting their perceived love of their life, much like other famous works of literature such as Romeo and Juliet. From reading the poem, I was also able to draw conclusions to other famous literary works that involved Egypt, including the importance of rivers in the culture. In the Bible, it is also clear how important rivers were to the Egyptian people. Moses is placed in a basket to drift down the river, and this leads him to be found by a princess who decides to raise him herself. The story demonstrates the feministic society that existed in ancient Egypt, as the princess took matters into her own hands, with complete autonomy in her decision-making, regardless of what else was going on in the empire at the time. Throughout the entire text, male and female lovers would alternate, and the poem ends without a response from the male character. Before the final female response, he speaks of growing ill as he cannot see or touch the one that he loves. After this, her tone seems to change, and she asks him several questions that remain unanswered. She offers parts of her body and explains that a day with one's lover is better than 1,000 days elsewhere. The fact that he does not reply could indicate that he really did fall ill and die, or that somehow after attaining her love, he's no longer as interested. It is challenging to analyze what mood the author intended to leave their audience with, as the story ends rather abruptly without a clear conclusion. Perhaps at the time there was a sequel. Egyptians have influenced modern culture immensely in the areas of mathematics, science, and medicine, as well as fashion and art, so it's only fitting that they also led the way in entertainment. Although this piece of literature, like many other ancient Egyptian texts, is not commonly known to the average reader, the same themes apply from works during the ancient Egyptian times to works such as Shakespeare or modern-day literature and movies. The theme of love is prominent and appears to be a concept that exists in all cultures during all periods of time, and after reading the beginning of the song that diverts the heart and researching ancient Egypt and the literature of its time, this concept is extremely clear.